Welcome to Ghostly Gazette, where the ordinary meets the eerie. Today we're diving into 5 spine-chilling encounters that will leave you questioning reality and peeking over your shoulder. Ready to uncover the secrets that lurk in the shadows? Stay tuned and beware of the unseen. My grandma told me this story a couple of times, each recount sending a chill down my spine. Her old house was located in a tight-knit neighborhood where people felt safe enough to leave their front doors unlocked. It was a time when everyone knew each other and there was a strong sense of community. The house itself was a split level, meaning there were 3 steps between each level. It was an old design, one that creaked with character and history. On this particular day, my grandma was on the 2nd level, taking a much-needed afternoon nap. This level of the house was on the opposite side from the back door, a cozy and quiet place to rest. Her loyal companion, a well-trained German shepherd named Max, lay by her side, ever watchful and protective. She had been asleep for about an hour when she was jolted awake by Max. The dog was usually calm and composed, but now he was whining and barking persistently, pacing next to her bed. The urgency in his behavior immediately put her on edge. Max wasn't one to react this way without reason. Groggy but alarmed, my grandma got out of bed and immediately felt a cold draft wafting through the house. This was unusual, as the house was usually quite warm, especially in the afternoons. She wrapped a robe around herself and followed Max, who was now running back and forth between her and the hallway leading to the back of the house. As she moved towards the back, the draft grew stronger. When she reached the hallway, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The attic stairs had been pulled down from the ceiling. This was particularly strange because the attic was rarely accessed, and she certainly hadn't used it recently. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. With Max by her side, she cautiously approached the stairs. Her eyes darted up into the dark, empty attic, but there was no sign of movement. The musty smell of the attic mingled with the fresh scent of rain that she now realized was coming from the open back door. Her sense of unease deepened. She went to close the back door, and that's when she noticed something even more unsettling. Despite the rain that had been falling steadily, there were no footprints leading from the attic stairs to the door. The wet ground outside the door was undisturbed, no muddy tracks, no sign of anyone having walked through it. It was as if whoever had been in the attic had simply vanished into thin air. My grandma's logical mind tried to make sense of it. She figured that someone must have been hiding in the attic, waiting for an opportunity to sneak out. Perhaps they had heard her stirring, panicked, and left through the back door. But the absence of footprints made this explanation difficult to accept. It was as if the intruder had floated out of the house, leaving no trace behind. The thought of some stranger being in the house without her knowing or seeing was the most disturbing part of the whole experience. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been watched, that her sanctuary had been violated. For weeks after, she found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, checking the attic stairs, and double-checking the locks on the doors and windows. In the days that followed, she mentioned the incident to a few neighbors, hoping someone might have seen something unusual, but no one had. The neighborhood continued its daily rhythms, seemingly untouched by the strange occurrence in my grandma's house. People still left their doors unlocked, still trusted in the safety of their close-knit community. But for my grandma, things had changed. The house, once a haven of comfort and familiarity, now felt different. There was an underlying tension, a sense of vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Even Max seemed more on edge, often staring at the attic door and growling softly. She decided to have the locks changed and started locking the doors, even during the day. She also arranged for a handyman to come and inspect the attic, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for what had happened. But the attic revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just old boxes, forgotten belongings, and a thick layer of dust. Life slowly returned to normal, but the memory of that day lingered. My grandma would often think back to it, wondering who had been in her house and why. The mystery remained unsolved, a ghostly presence that haunted her thoughts. Years later, as she recounted the story to me, the fear was still evident in her eyes. It wasn't just the idea of a stranger in the house that terrified her, it was the not knowing, the unanswered questions that kept her awake at night. She had faced many challenges in her life, but this one left a mark on her soul, a reminder of the unseen dangers that can lurk in the most familiar places. It's a story that has stayed with me, a piece of family history that I share with others to this day. The image of the open back door, the pulled-down attic stairs, and the absence of footprints in the rain is etched into my mind. I'll never forget the day that sent chills down my spine and left me questioning what my 3-year-old son Miles might be capable of seeing. It was a typical sunny afternoon in Dayton, Ohio. Miles and I were out for a drive, heading back home after running a few errands. He was in the back seat, happily singing along to a nursery rhyme, his sweet little voice filling the car. Everything seemed perfectly normal until we passed by a modest cemetery. This cemetery wasn't one of those eerie, grandiose places with towering headstones and statues. It was simple, with only flowers and small plaques. If you didn't know any better, you might mistake it for a beautifully kept garden. It basically looks like a giant garden. As we drove by, Miles suddenly stopped singing. The abrupt silence caught my attention, so I glanced in the rearview mirror to check on him. He was staring intently out the window, his little finger pointing towards the cemetery. Then he said something that made my heart skip a beat. "Look at all those people," he exclaimed. Confused, I turned to look at the cemetery. From my vantage point, it was as empty as always. There wasn't a single person in sight. I furrowed my brow and asked him what he was talking about. "All those people over there," he repeated. "There's sure a lot of grandmas." Now, this wasn't the first time Miles had said something strange, but this felt different. I asked him what the people were doing. His response sent a shiver down my spine. "They're all standing there, looking down at the grass," he said, his voice matter of fact, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. At that moment, an icy dread washed over me. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and I couldn't get away from that cemetery fast enough. I pressed my foot on the accelerator and hurried us home, my mind racing with questions and unsettling thoughts. Later that day, after we had returned home, Miles was in the living room watching his favorite TV show. I was still trying to shake off the eerie feeling from our earlier conversation when he turned to me and said something that stopped me in my tracks. "You know, they weren't alive." Thinking he was referring to the cartoon characters on the screen, I asked him what he meant. "Those people we saw. They were all paused," he said, his innocent eyes wide and serious. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I had no idea what to make of what Miles was saying. Could my son have some kind of sixth sense? Or was his young, imaginative mind creating something out of nothing? As the days went by, I found myself replaying the incident over and over in my mind. Every time I drove past that cemetery, I would glance at it nervously, half expecting to see what Miles had seen. But it always looked the same, empty, peaceful, and completely normal. Despite my efforts to rationalize what happened, the memory stayed with me. Miles didn't mention the cemetery or the people again, and I didn't press him on it, not wanting to scare him or feed into his imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had happened. One evening, while tucking Miles into bed, I decided to gently broach the subject one last time. "Hey buddy," I said softly, "do you remember those people you saw at the cemetery?" Miles nodded, his eyes sleepy but attentive. "Can you tell me more about them?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and curious. He thought for a moment before answering. "They looked like grandmas and grandpas. They were just standing there, not moving, like they were waiting for something." My heart pounded in my chest. "Were they doing anything else? Did they look at you?" He shook his head. "No, they didn't see me. They were all looking down at the ground." "Did they seem happy or sad?" I probed further. Miles shrugged. I don't know. They just looked like they were paused. I kissed him goodnight and left his room, my mind swirling with his words. I decided to do some research, looking into local legends and ghost stories, hoping to find something that might explain what Miles had seen. Dayton, like many old towns, had its share of ghost stories and haunted places, but nothing that seemed to match our experience. I reached out to a local historian, an old friend of the family, and asked if there were any significant events or unusual stories related to that particular cemetery. He told me it was one of the older burial grounds in the area, dating back to the early 1800s. Many of the graves belonged to early settlers and their descendants. He mentioned that some people believed the spirits of the deceased sometimes lingered, especially in places with a lot of history. But this wasn't entirely satisfying. There were no reports of strange sightings or paranormal activity at that cemetery. It seemed that whatever Miles had seen, it wasn't part of any known local legend. I decided to confide in my friend Derek. I told him the whole story, hoping he might have some insights or know of similar experiences. Derek listened intently, and his response was both comforting and unsettling. "Jeff, you're not the first person to report something like this," he said. "Children are often said to be more sensitive to the paranormal. They haven't built up the skepticism that adults have, so they might see things that we can't." He suggested that Miles might have had a brief glimpse into another realm, seeing the spirits of those who were buried there. It was a chilling thought, but it made a strange kind of sense. It explained why Miles saw people that I couldn't, and why they appeared to be standing, looking down, almost as if they were mourning their own graves. After my conversation with Derek, I tried to come to terms with the idea that Miles might have a gift, an ability to see things beyond the ordinary. I didn't want to scare him or discourage his natural curiosity, but I also wanted to protect him from anything that might be harmful or frightening. I decided to keep a close eye on him, paying attention to any other unusual comments or behavior. Over time, life returned to its regular rhythm, and the incident at the cemetery became a strange but fascinating memory. Still, every now and then, I would find myself thinking about that day, wondering what it was that Miles saw. I would glance at him, playing happily or watching TV, and feel a mix of awe and concern. If he truly had a gift, what other things might he see as he grew older? One thing was certain: that drive past the cemetery had changed my perspective on the world. It made me realize that there are things out there that we can't explain, things that exist just beyond the veil of our understanding. And sometimes it takes the innocent eyes of a child to remind us of the mysteries that still surround us. As for Miles, he seemed to move on, his young mind filled with new adventures and discoveries, but I kept the memory close. Years ago, when I was just 8 years old, my family lived in this big, weird house on the edge of a small town. It was the kind of place with creaky floors, drafty windows, and an eerie, isolated feel to it. The kind of house where shadows seemed to move on their own, and you could swear you heard whispers in the walls at night. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though my brother and I were only a couple of grades apart, we went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon. It was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked before I left, a responsibility that made me feel both proud and a little bit scared. One morning, as I was doing my usual rounds before heading out, I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on. The basement was always a creepy place, filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and the faint smell of mildew. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just turned off the light and closed the door, thinking maybe my mom or her boyfriend had forgotten to do it the night before. When I got home that afternoon, I was surprised to see the basement door open again, with the light shining brightly down the staircase. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off, assuming I had forgotten to actually take care of it in the morning. I walked over to turn off the light and close the door, but when I got to the top of the basement stairs, I froze in my tracks. At the bottom of the staircase, there was a large, shadowy figure. It looked like a man, standing motionless in the darkness. Panic surged through me. I slammed the door shut and pushed a bunch of boxes against it, hoping to barricade whatever or whoever was down there. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I ran to my bedroom and hid in my closet, trembling with fear. For months, I didn't tell anyone in my family about what I had seen. I was convinced that it was a ghost, and I didn't think anyone would believe me. Ghost stories were common in our town, and the idea of a haunted basement seemed almost typical for our old, creaky house. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the memory of that shadowy figure stayed with me, haunting my thoughts. About a year after that incident, my mom and her boyfriend started noticing that small amounts of money were going missing. It was never more than $60 at a time, but over the months, it added up to a total of around $900. They were baffled, trying to figure out how it was happening. Our house wasn't in a high-crime area, and they couldn't imagine someone breaking in without us noticing. One night, in a fit of frustration, we decided to walk around the house with flashlights, looking for any clues. My mom's boyfriend had the idea that maybe someone was getting in through a window or a forgotten door. We searched every room, peered into every corner, and finally made our way to the basement. In the dim light of our flashlights, we noticed something strange, a small hole in the outside wall of the house, leading to a narrow crawl space. My mom's boyfriend, being the bravest of us, squeezed through the opening and crawled inside. Moments later, he called out to us, his voice echoing through the darkness. It turned out that some creep had been climbing in through that small hole, shimmying through the crawl space, and coming up into the house through the basement. The realization hit us like a ton of bricks. This person had been sneaking into our home for who knows how long, taking money and who knows what else. My stomach turned as I remembered the shadowy figure I had seen at the bottom of the basement stairs. It hadn't been a ghost. It had been a real living person. The most terrifying moment of all was realizing that I had been alone in the house with this stranger on at least one occasion. The thought of him lurking in the shadows while I went about my day, completely unaware, was horrifying. I shuddered at the memory of his dark silhouette and the cold fear that had gripped me that day. We immediately sealed up the hole and took extra precautions to secure the house. My mom and her boyfriend reported the incidents to the police, but we never found out who the intruder was or what his intentions might have been. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of unease whenever I think about that house. The creaks and whispers that once seemed like the harmless quirks of an old home now feel like echoes of a time when something truly sinister lurked just out of sight. I often wonder what might have happened if I hadn't slammed that door, if I hadn't barricaded myself in my closet. It's a question that haunts me, just like the memory of that shadowy figure at the bottom of the basement stairs. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the sky transitions from a deep blue to a star-studded black. I was sitting in the passenger seat of my mom's car, my mind wandering as we drove through the winding country roads that led back to our town. The air was filled with the sounds of rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets, creating a serene backdrop for our journey home. My mom was driving, her eyes focused on the road ahead. The glow from the dashboard illuminated her face, highlighting the look of calm concentration she always wore when driving. We were returning from a visit to my grandparents' house, and the journey had been uneventful so far. The hum of the engine was almost hypnotic, and I found myself sinking into a relaxed state, lulled by the rhythmic motion of the car. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a man dashed into the road. My mom slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt, the sudden stop jolting us both forward in our seats. The man was standing directly in front of us, illuminated by the car's headlights. He was disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty, and his face bore a wild, desperate expression. "What the hell?" my mom muttered under her breath, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. She hesitated for a moment, trying to assess the situation. It was nighttime, and the darkness around us seemed to press in, making everything beyond the reach of the headlights appear ominously shadowy. As we sat there, stunned, 3 other men emerged from the forest that lined the road. They appeared out of the darkness like specters, their intentions immediately clear as they moved towards the car. Panic surged through me as I realized they were trying to open the car doors. The handles rattled as they pulled on them, each man attempting to gain entry. "Lock the doors," I shouted, my voice breaking the tense silence that had enveloped us. My mom fumbled for the lock button, her hands shaking. With a click, all the doors were securely locked. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. The men outside grew more agitated, their attempts to open the doors becoming more frantic. One of the men banged on my window, his face pressed against the glass, eyes wide with a manic intensity. "Open the door," he shouted, his voice muffled but insistent. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. The sense of danger was palpable, and I could see my mom's face contorting with fear and determination. "Hold on," she said, her voice steely. She shifted the car into gear and pressed down on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, and the men stumbled back, momentarily thrown off balance. My mom didn't hesitate, she gunned it, the car speeding down the road towards the nearest town. As we sped away, I glanced back and saw the figures of the men receding into the darkness. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, the foremost being the terrifying realization of how close we had come to who knows what. The adrenaline coursed through my veins, making my hands tremble and my breath come in short gasps. We didn't slow down until we reached the outskirts of the nearest town. The bright streetlights and the presence of other cars and people brought a sense of safety. My mom pulled into a gas station, and we both sat there for a moment, the engine idling as we tried to collect ourselves. "Are you okay?" she asked, turning to look at me. Her face was pale, and I could see the fear lingering in her eyes. "Yeah," I replied, my voice shaky. "What about you?" She nodded, taking a deep breath. "I'm fine, just shaken." That was too close. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. The warmth of the car and the familiar hum of the engine seemed to slowly soothe our frazzled nerves. Finally, my mom spoke again. "Remember to always lock your car after you start it," she said, her tone serious. "If the doors hadn't been unlocked, who knows what could have happened?" We decided to go inside the gas station to report the incident to the authorities and to calm down a bit more. The attendant, a kind older man, listened to our story with a concerned expression and assured us that he would contact the police. As we waited, we bought some water and sat down at a small table inside the gas station. The fluorescent lights and the mundane normalcy of the setting provided a stark contrast to the terror we had just experienced. We called my dad and told him what had happened. His voice, filled with worry, was also a comfort. He reassured us that we had done the right thing by getting away as fast as we could. That night, as we finally drove home, the incident replayed in my mind. The thought of those men, their faces, and their intentions haunted me. But amidst the fear, there was a sense of gratitude that we had managed to escape unharmed, and that my mom had the presence of mind to act quickly. From that day on, locking the car doors became an automatic habit, a small but vital precaution. This happened just a few years ago on what seemed to be an ordinary late afternoon. My husband was at work, our sons were at school, and I had the house to myself. It was the perfect opportunity to indulge in some rare, uninterrupted relaxation. I decided to take a long, luxurious bath. For context, our house has a first-floor master suite, providing a sense of seclusion that I usually appreciated. I locked both the bedroom and bathroom doors, a habit I picked up for a sense of extra security, then began filling up the tub. The warm, fragrant water was exactly what I needed to unwind. I was just about to get in when our 2 dogs, usually calm and content, suddenly hopped up and ran to the bathroom door. I listened, perplexed, as they growled softly, Almost simultaneously, I heard the distinct sound of the door to our garage opening and footsteps approaching the bedroom. My first thought was that my husband had come home early, a pleasant surprise that I was happy to welcome. I expected to hear him try the bedroom door and realize it was locked. But to my confusion, I heard the bedroom door open without hesitation. It was strange, but I still assumed it was my husband despite the locked door. However, the dog's behavior was alarming. Their slow, deep growls and raised hackles were completely out of character. Our dogs rarely barked and almost never growled. They were staring intently at the space under the bathroom door, heads lowered, growling and backing away slowly. I bent down to look and saw movement, unmistakably feet, on the other side of the door. Panic set in as I realized my phone was in the bedroom, completely out of reach. I was trapped in the bathroom with no way to call for help. The only weapon I had was a can of Lysol, which seemed pathetically inadequate against a potential intruder. My mind raced with terrifying scenarios as I imagined the door being kicked in at any moment. I clutched the can of Lysol tightly, my heart pounding in my chest. For over an hour I sat there, paralyzed with fear. Every minute felt like an eternity. The dogs continued their low growls, never taking their eyes off the gap under the door. The footsteps had stopped, but I couldn't bring myself to believe that the intruder had left. My mind played tricks on me, amplifying every creak and groan of the house into something sinister. Eventually, the dogs began to settle down. Their growls subsided, and they moved away from the door, but they remained alert. The silence that followed was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. I strained to hear any signs of movement, but there was nothing. I waited, still gripping the Lysol can, until I heard the familiar sound of my husband's car pulling into the driveway. When my husband finally walked through the door, I was a bundle of nerves. He was shocked to hear my story and immediately took charge. He checked the entire house thoroughly, room by room, but found no signs of an intruder. Every single door was locked, just as we had left them. There were no indications of forced entry, no misplaced items, and nothing out of the ordinary. Despite the thorough search, the experience left me deeply unsettled. For days I replayed the events in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. The dog's reaction was the most puzzling aspect. Their behavior had been so uncharacteristic and so clearly responsive to something or someone in the house. We considered all possible explanations. Maybe it was a ghost, some residual energy causing the disturbance, though we had never experienced anything like that before. Perhaps it was an intruder who somehow managed to enter and exit without leaving any trace. Or maybe it was a shared hallucination between me and the dogs, though that seemed the least likely. To this day, I don't have an explanation for what happened. The incident has become a mysterious chapter in our family's history, one that I still think about from time to time, especially when I'm alone in the house. The sense of security that I once felt in my home was irrevocably shaken. Now I always carry my phone with me, and I double-check all the locks, ensuring that every door is secure. What I experienced that afternoon remains one of the most unnerving events of my life. Whether it was a trick of the mind, a ghostly encounter, or something else entirely, I'll never forget the sheer terror of being trapped and helpless, waiting for a threat that never fully revealed itself. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the unknown. If these bone-chilling stories kept you on the edge of your seat, be sure to hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Share your own eerie encounters in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and beware of the shadows.